Funding for this program was provided by the Annenberg CPB project.
In every aspect of life, new ideas and new values were taking over in France. Even Louis XVI supported the American Revolution. These were the people who lit the fuse, the educated, the better off. And these were the people who exploded. The death of the old regime, this time on the Western tradition.
And now, UCLA professor Eugen Weber's continuing journey through the history of Western civilization.
The American Revolution that I talked about last time deserves our attention not only for its own sake, but also because it was the first of a long series of revolutions that were to mark the years from 1776 onwards, a series that isn't over yet. And the revolution was doubly significant because the men and the women who made it and those who got involved in it managed to solve its central problem in a way that makes it rather different from the other revolutions that we have seen since then. Revolution, you see, is rather like a snowball on a slope. It's not easy to get it going, but once it's on its way, it is hard to stop it rolling and growing until it becomes an avalanche. And the problem in America was to stop the revolution for independence from snowballing into a popular and democratic revolution. The Declaration of Independence and Articles of Confederation had marked the triumph of the democratic view, which favored popular sovereignty and little government. The Federalist Papers and the Constitution, on the other hand, marked a sort of counter-revolution of those who distrusted the people and who believed in strong government. To the Federalists like Alexander Hamilton, democracy was nearly anarchy. And the way to prevent power from slipping into the hands of an illiterate mob was to have government by the best people in the land, people like Hamilton himself, who could be trusted to use power in a moderate and responsible fashion. So at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, a constitution was designed that was democratic enough to be adopted, but not democratic enough to threaten the power and the controlling position of the upper and propertied classes. And this is what is so special, so unusual about the American Revolution, that it very soon stopped being a revolution, that the snowball was stopped before it became an avalanche. Even democratic leaders were able to indulge in the luxury of very revolutionary, very radical ideas, while living and acting in a very conservative manner. It was possible to declare that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness were inalienable rights of all men, and to provide legal protection for slavery. It was possible to declare that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, and to accept a constitution that did not provide for direct representation. So the American Revolution was ambivalent, both conservative and revolutionary. It could remain conservative because in relative terms, The conservatism of colonial Americans was more radical by the general standards of Europeans at the time. And conveniently, the deepest reactionaries in America, the loyalists who clung to king and empire and who might have forced a deeper radicalization by their intransigence, the loyalists left or were forced to leave, mostly for Canada. And those who remained could afford to remain relatively conservative, simply because the colonies had never known oppression and because, as human institutions go, America always had been free, excepting, of course, for slavery. On the other hand, the American Revolution was revolutionary because the colonists took the risks of rebellion and because they checkmated those Americans who wanted a society like the aristocratic society of England and the rest of Europe. But most of all, the revolution was revolutionary because it showed how certain abstract doctrines, such as the rights of man and the sovereignty of the people, could be, as John Adams put it, could be reduced to practice by assemblies of pretty level-headed gentlemen exercising constituent power in the name of the people. The effects of all this on Europe were very important. The revolution inspired the sense of a new era. It added new substance to the concept of progress, a whole new dimension to the ideas of liberty and equality that the Enlightenment had spread abroad. It got people into the habit of thinking more concretely about political questions. It made them more readily critical of their own governments and their own system. It dethroned England as the inspiration of enlightened thinkers and set up America as the model for a better world. It brought written constitutions, declarations of rights, constituent conventions into the realm of the possible. Above all, perhaps, America made Europe seem unsatisfactory to a lot of people in the middle and the lower classes, and to those members of the upper classes who sympathized with them. It made a lot of Europeans feel sorry for themselves. And it induced a kind of spiritual flight from the old regime and from the values that it represented. But all this was happening in Europe, not in America. What it comes down to is that the American Revolution, in its doctrinal aspects, opened up the possibilities of political change, possibilities far wider than was necessary in practice in the America of 1776, but not in Europe. So while the formal example of revolution may have been given in Philadelphia, the effective example was going to be given in Paris. In 1789, stormed the Bastille, 1776, that set Europe on fire. It is the French Revolution, not the American, which puts the question of the price of revolution, which gives us the certainty that there will always be a very high price to pay. And it leaves us wondering, when everything is said and done, whether even that high price will actually pay for the goods ordered, for the changes and advantages we might expect from revolution. In considering the French Revolution, the first thing we have to remember is how popular the very idea of revolution had become in Europe in this last quarter of the 18th century. You find village priests who keep the encyclopedia and the works of the philosophers on their bookshelves. You find laborers and peasants reading pamphlets about the new ideas, or being read to if they can't read themselves. You have the tremendous popularity of a man like Lafayette, returned from the American War to become a hero at home. And Benjamin Franklin, who becomes a kind of saint of the Enlightenment. And, of course, you have the philosophes. None of the philosophes actually advocated violent revolution, but their writings spread revolutionary ideas, and along with the books and pamphlets that were remaking the European mind, especially the French mind, there was propaganda for radical change heard in the fashionable salons of Paris, in cafes, and in societies of every kind which were founded in great numbers at this time. Agricultural societies, philanthropical associations, provincial academies, correspondence societies, and reading rooms where people could not only read but talk. The Masonic lodges especially were favorable to philosophical infiltration because they had the same ideals as the philosophes: civil equality, religious toleration, the liberation of the human personality from all institutions that kept it immature. And the lodges didn't include just bourgeois, but priests and nobles and even the brothers of Louis XVI. Then there was the theater. A playwright like Beaumarchais, whose patron was Queen Marie Antoinette. A man like Beaumarchais was busy writing subversive comedies like The Marriage of Figaro, which raised doubts about the value of noble birth. Marie Antoinette even acted in his plays for fun, while the king used Beaumarchais to supply arms to the American rebels, and in the hands of another Mason, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, Figaro became the hero of an immensely popular opera, and Masonic ideas provided the core of an even greater opera, The Magic Flute. The virtues of humanity were also affirmed by a new interest in the necessary virtues of the citizen. And this went along with a revival of the classical models of good citizenship in Greece and especially Rome. You remember the Rhode Island patriot who wanted to awaken all that was Roman in Providence. Well, a lot of the rhetoric of 18th century revolution referred to the resolute and ruthless heroes of the Roman Republic who sacrificed themselves and everybody else in the interests of state and society. Some of the most effective propaganda in this line was produced by painters. And the most representative of these was probably Jacques-Louis David, the harbinger of revolution in art. In 1784, the year after the Peace of Paris ended the American Revolution, David painted a scene called the Oath of the Horatii that had been originally inspired by a tragedy of Corneille. The story of the three Horace brothers who go off to fight for Rome, swearing before their father that they're going to win or die. David's historical scenes were invariably manifestos for stoicism, courage, civic spirit. They were seen as an indictment of effete aristocratic ways and an advertisement for a return to the stern, patriotic morals of Republican Rome. So David became a culture hero, and in 1789 he painted another classical scene of Brutus, the Roman consul, receiving the corpses of his own sons whom he had condemned to death for treachery. It wasn't just the moral uplift, it wasn't just the political implication, it was also the setting and the costumes that made a strong statement for the simple virtues, for a sober architecture without curves or curlicues, for dress and furniture that were spare and simple, and by implication virtuous. This had a tremendous impact on fashion. Virtue doesn't come easily, but dressing in a virtuous style does. So Men cut their hair short in the Roman style, a la Brutus, and women adopted the dresses and the hairdos of Brutus's daughters, and eventually the really up-to-date adopted the very flimsy dresses that the Sabine women were supposed to have worn when the Romans stole them away, with straight lines and practically no underwear, and the breasts exposed and nowhere to keep a hanky or a key, which in turn introduced another novelty, the ridicule or reticule, which was the ancestor of our handbags. So in every aspect of life, new values were taking over. Indeed, by the 1780s, these new values and ideas had been around so long that they didn't seem very new or very revolutionary. People were beginning to take them for granted. And even the people against whom they were directed, the aristocrats, were beginning to take them for granted. But they were playing with fire. Louis XVI, for instance, had supported the American rebels and helped them win their revolution. French noblemen like the Marquis de Lafayette had fought in the American army and had become heroes in France because they fought for a cause that the whole machinery of the French state was geared to crush at home. At the same time, the monarchy was growing weaker because its finances had been undermined by the cost of war across the Atlantic. The American Revolution had cost France the equivalent of 4 years' revenues. Most of this had been raised by borrowing. More than half of every year's budget had to go just to paying the interest on the debt. And all sorts of other things were going wrong. The weather was bad, the crops were bad, the price of bread was getting higher and higher. Wages stood still, prices went up, and so did the taxes that a desperate government trying to make ends meet was trying to squeeze out of the taxpayers. And since a lot of the French were not taxpayers, because nobles and clergy and officers of the crown didn't have to pay anything, the burden fell on the people least able to pay them. This last factor was very important because the mass of people would not have been stirred by theories if they hadn't been suffering in practice. And they were suffering terribly, even though the economic problems of France were not insuperable. These problems could have been solved, at least in part, by a government that knew its mind. The deficit could have been made up. The national debt could have been handled, but to do this, you had to break the privileges of the privileged. You had to break the privileges, especially of the clergy and the nobility. You had to make them pay taxes. You had to cut the pensions that were sucking the treasury dry. Just one family of royal favorites, the Polignacs, were getting pensions equivalent to 1.5% of the annual revenues of the crown for doing nothing, but for doing it very gracefully. If you could do away with pensions and tax exemptions, you could probably set the country's finances on an even keel. But of course, none of this was done. So here was a repetition in many ways of the situation in the American colonies. The French government, like the British, tried to tighten things up for the sake of efficiency and for greater revenues, and it was opposed at first by certain privileged groups, nobles, clergy, gentlemen, lawyers, and intellectuals. Although there was a background of discontent, it didn't have to explode unless the fuses were lit, and the people who lit them were, as in America, the better off people, the educated, who brandished slogans like liberty and natural law and representation in order to defend their privileges. The same thing was going on in other parts of Europe. In 1786, there was a revolution in Holland, which had to be put down by Prussian troops. In 1788, there was a revolution in Belgium, and there was unrest throughout the Habsburg Empire, and all were directed against governments that tried to disturb old traditions, old institutions, to attack privileges, to introduce more rational reforms, more efficient administration. And that's just what happened in France. The French government, under a fairly able Minister of Finance, Charles de Calonne, tried to rationalize the management of the country, tried to move into the modern age by abolishing the anachronistic survivals of the feudal system. But paradoxically, the government tried to do this by reviving an old feudal institution, the Estates General, a representative assembly that had met just once since 1500 and not at all since 1614. The government wanted to play the third estate, the commoners, against the privileged orders. But the ploy failed and the third estate took over, claiming quite rightly that it really represented the nation. It declared itself the National Assembly, and after a lot of talk, much of it foolish, the representatives of the nobility and the clergy joined them, and that, in June 1789, was the beginning of the Constitutional Revolution. Then, on the 4th of August, in a great burst of enthusiasm, the Assembly abolished the feudal order. The sitting opened with a Viscount proposing the abolition of all economic privileges, no more forced labor, no more personal serfdom, no more tax exemptions. A duke supported him strongly, and the proposals were voted with enthusiasm. And after this, all particular privileges were sacrificed on the altar of the fatherland. Hunting rights went the way of all flesh. Guilds and corporations were suppressed. The clergy gave up their tithes. The magistrates who bought their offices gave them up too. And this went on until 2 o'clock in the morning. It's interesting to compare David's view of the crucial moment when the Third Estate swore never to separate until France got a written constitution like the Americans had, to compare this with a painting of the Oath of the Horatii, because the gestures are exactly the same, which demonstrates either that life imitates art or that artists imitate themselves. At any rate, when the sitting was over, the administrative and political unity of France had been achieved, something that absolute monarchy had always tried and never managed to do. And the old regime was dead. On its grave, 3 weeks later, the Assembly proclaimed the Declaration of the Rights of Man, full of echoes from America and more distant echoes of Locke and Rousseau. It might seem that by the end of August 1789, the French Revolution had been made, and that insofar as the public in London and Paris and Philadelphia was concerned, all was over but the cheering. Unfortunately, as you know, it wasn't over, because just as the king had played the Third Estate against the nobles, and the Third Estate had got the better of him, so the Third Estate, in order to get its way, raised up its own monster, and that was the people, the mob of Paris. Back on July the 14th, the Paris mob had stormed the Bastille, had torn it down, had set free the prisoners, had massacred the soldiers and the officers inside. It didn't matter that the old prison was practically empty, because its fall kept the reformers in power in the National Assembly. And then, while mobs rioted in urban France, peasant mobs had gone on the rampage in rural France as well, against the oppressive remains of the feudal system. This is the background of the Declaration of the Rights of Man. And then in October 1789, the Paris mob, led and controlled by Paris market women, marched on Versailles. They massacred the king's guards. They brought the royal family back to Paris. The baker, the baker's wife, and the baker's boy is what they called them. They brought the royal family out of their safe, splendid refuge into the capital of democracy. So the revolution had got out of hand. The National Assembly itself could not control it. And the snowball was about to become an avalanche, as we shall see next time.
Funding for this program was provided by the Annenberg CPB project.
For information on this program and others in the Annenberg CPB collection, call 1-800-LEARNER. For information on this program and others in the Annenberg CPB collection, call 1-800-LEARNER.
Funding for this program was provided by the Annenberg CPB project.
It started out with ringing words and heads held high. It ended up with grandiose slogans and heads cut off. It was meant to bring equality and liberty. Instead, it brought dictatorship and the new hierarchy of a great, powerful empire. The French Revolution, this time on the Western tradition.
And now, UCLA professor Eugen Weber's continuing journey through the history of Western civilization.
As we saw in our last program, the first years of the French Revolution were a fascinating time because everything seemed possible. An English poet, just 21 years old, William Wordsworth, goes to France in 1791. He falls in love with a young woman. He falls in love, with France, with a revolution, and this is what he has to say about it. Bliss was it in that dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven. O times in which the meager, stale, forbidding ways of custom, law, and statute took at once the attraction of a country in romance. It was a fairy tale, a land of romance. But there was more than romance. There was enlightenment in action. There was history on the march. The revolution perfected what generations of kings and royal ministers had worked so hard to achieve and never managed to achieve. The revolution centralized France. It abolished particular laws, particular privileges, particular servitudes. No more different institutions in different provinces, no more internal customs barriers between provinces that hamper the circulation of people and goods. The revolution establishes one law, one court system, one administration, one bureaucracy, one set of rights and duties for all the French, which really means for all Frenchmen, because Roman precedent didn't give women much status. So at last, with some mitigations, reason was in power, or so it seemed. Reason gave France a constitution. It introduced representative government and universal suffrage, that is, universal male suffrage. It abolished the old provinces and divided the country into new areas called departments of reasonable size, with reasonable names like Loiret and Basse-Pyrénées, taken from a local river or mountain range. The revolution abolished the old system of weights and measures, which wasn't a system at all, but a jungle of different local measures. It introduced the metric system from the Greek word for measure. It created a new calendar with new months with wonderful names like Floréal and Thermidor and Fructidor, evocative of nature and of productive activities. And it replaced the 7-day week with 10-day periods, decades, so workers would only waste 3 days of rest a month instead of 4. It abolished the local languages and dialects like Flemish, Breton, Basque, and replaced them with one national language, French, which would be taught in schools to all children, not just to a privileged few. And it decreed that careers from now on would depend not on birth, but on talent, on a person's capacity and performance and merit. Unfortunately, most of these wonderful reforms remained on paper. Universal suffrage, public education, the generalization of the French language and of the metric system were all going to wait another 100 years. The reforms that did work, however, caused a great deal of trouble. Careers, at least for a while and up to a point, did open to talent, and that, of course, caused a good deal of friction. Even more troublesome was the problem of religious reform. Although the revolution didn't move against religion as such, you notice that Sunday disappeared from the new calendar, and people were also encouraged to abandon reactionary names of saints, of kings, to replace them with progressive names of heroes or of useful things, names like Brutus, Gracchus, Hector, or else cabbage, dandelion, carrot. And one of my colleagues has remarked that revolutionary names read rather like a seed catalogue. Moreover, the revolution represented religious tolerance. It removed restrictions against outcasts like actors or public executioners. More important, it emancipated Protestants, it emancipated Jews. Everybody was free to practice what religion they pleased, provided it didn't threaten the state. And that was hardly acceptable to good Catholics. What was much worse from the Catholic point of view was that the new state wanted to control the clergy even more than the old state had done. It confiscated church property and it put the clergy on salary. So priests became public employees. They had to swear a loyalty oath. They had to serve the state and not the Pope. And that was going to cause big trouble. The Pope forbade the clergy to swear allegiance to the state and the Constitution. Those who did swear were excommunicated, and that divided the French Church into a minority who took the oath to the state and a majority who refused and were imprisoned or exiled or forced into hiding. And it divided French citizens into those who obeyed the government and those who obeyed the Pope. Among these latter was Louis XVI, who had accommodated himself to all the other changes of the previous years. But the religious crisis prevented him from carrying out in practice the constitution he had sworn to uphold in theory, and in due course he was going to lose his head. And so was the Queen, both executed in the great square which Louis's grandfather helped design and which is now called with a certain black humor Place de la Concorde. At this point, the evolutionary change which revolution had simply accelerated was derailed, and France was torn wide open by a real violent revolution. The monarchy was done away with, the liberal constitution was jettisoned, dictatorship and terror took over. Where the first stage of the revolution had been liberal and not very violent, the second stage, which began around 1792, was illiberal, attempting to impose things on France that France wasn't prepared for. So it had to use force, and it had to use terror. Political freedom had to be protected by dictatorship. The revolution said that it stood for liberty and equality. But liberty and equality are very hard to reconcile because the exercise of liberty aggravates natural inequalities. Reason and tolerance are also hard to reconcile because reasoning can lead to intolerance, as it did when dogmatic rationalists went to war against priests in the name of reason, and dogmatic equalitarians went to war against rank, wealth, or any kind of distinction, even ability. So liberty and equality became victims of a revolution that was carried out in their name. The guillotine was an apt symbol for the situation in which well-meaning enthusiasts set out, as one of them said, to force people to be free. Remember, however, that no one set out deliberately to make life hell. The terror, as it was called, was the use of force or legal violence in order to make the world a better place. So it killed a few thousand people by execution, then it killed a few 100,000 in the civil wars it set off. And it also laid down such basic traditions for the future as fixed prices, which drove goods and especially food out of the market, a paper currency that quickly lost its value and gave paper money a bad name in France for the next 100 years, a police state to enforce its decrees and stifle criticism, a police state much tighter than the Inquisition ever managed to impose, and finally, recourse to foreign war in order to solve insoluble problems at home. France had to face what looked like the threat of reactionary foreign powers. In 1792, France mobilized an army of volunteers to fight Prussia and Austria. In 1793, the revolutionary government declared war on England, Holland, and Spain all in 1 month. On the other hand, the revolution had turned the country into a nation. It had declared that the French, who had been merely subjects of their king, were now citizens of a sovereign state, equal shareholders in the nation. That was a good thing, and it was going to pay dividends in the future. It meant that the sovereignty of the people was much more powerful and much more encroaching than the sovereignty of the king had ever been. It meant that the government which represented that sovereignty could raise more taxes than any king had ever done, and it meant that the state could mobilize not just the money of its citizens, but their bodies too. This is a French army recruitment post. Now, conscription wasn't new in Europe. The Swedes had used a sort of draft in the 30 Years' War, and Louis XIV's great war minister, Louvois, had tried to introduce it in France, although he had to drop the idea because of too much opposition. Then, Prussia perfected its system of regular military service for all healthy males, along with a reserve and with plans for general mobilization, which is how Prussia survived and prospered through the 18th century. By 1789, it kept nearly 200,000 men under arms, where the King of France could only manage 180,000, even though France was so much larger. And Prussia's soldiers cost her just 1/3 of what France's smaller army cost. But by 1792, 3 years into the revolution, the French had gone to war with most of Europe, and they had requisitioned their own population en masse. By 1794, the French army was nearly 1 million strong, 5 times more than it had been 3 years before, and a new era had opened in military history, which we can fairly call the gun fodder era. The basic military formation of the old regime was the thin file of highly trained soldiers, 1, 2, 3 ranks. The basic military formation of the new regime would be the column, a massive thing well adapted to a lot of ill-trained conscripts who have to be kept together under fire. It was all very understandable, but the fact remains that no general of the old regime would have dreamed to throw his men in heavy columns like this under the enemy fire. The thin file did not produce decisive results, but it spared the men, and the men were hard to get, and they were expensive to recruit, expensive to train. But the generals of the revolution, and later of the empire, spent their men without counting the losses. They knew that the state could always get more for them because it saw the whole French nation as a reservoir, and the reservoir was free. It's possible that the large-scale massacres which followed were connected with a revival of the idea of total war, an idea that the 18th century had forgotten. The difficulties of 1793 brought about not only the mobilization of men, but also, as you've heard, the mobilization of civilians of all ages and sexes, and the attempt to control national resources in a way that had never been seen before. The difference between the total war which the French invented rather casually in the 1790s and the total war which we dread today in the 1980s, though it's very great, is only a matter of degree. And once again, we are faced with this curious paradox that something which started so hopefully and with such excellent intentions as the French Revolution did should produce such extraordinary and terrifying results. The victories of revolutionary generals, for example, were facilitated by the fact that they abandoned all the accepted rules and inhibitions and conventions of warfare as warfare had been conceived in the 18th century. And that made warfare much, much worse. The destructive wars of the 17th century had led to the devising of a system of limited warfare in the 18th century, formalizing the conduct of war, limiting its destructiveness both for soldiers and for civilians. But the French generals now abandoned this. First, because of necessity. They were fighting everybody at once and they didn't have time for niceties. Second, because they didn't care about the established order, about the established code. They violated borders, they fomented revolutions, they lived off the country, and they moved much faster. They ignored all the nice, comfortable conventions, and so they reintroduced the old, ruthless practices into current use. And eventually their enemies would adopt them too. The French saw themselves engaged in a great world struggle for the liberation of peoples from the yoke of dynastic tyrannies. They pledged war to the castles, peace to the cottages, war against the oppressors for the oppressed. They declared that they would assist every people that wanted to be free. Depending on how you look at it, this was a blank check for rebellion or an imperialistic provocation against the other powers of Europe. But it turned out that some populations didn't want to be liberated or didn't want to adopt the institutions the French thought they should adopt. Such people had to be freed of their inhibitions. They needed French guides and commissars and occupiers to teach them to be free, just as the French themselves had had to be taught. And so here you had the ideology and the practice of national revolution, in which revolutionary disorder became revolutionary dictatorship, and wars of national liberation became wars of national imperialism. Another instance of how the revolution perfected what generations of French kings had worked for and never accomplished. All this culminated under the leadership of a dictator of genius, a great general, and a great administrator, Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon began his career as an artillery officer just on the eve of the revolution and just in time to take advantage of the opportunities that the revolution and its wars held out. His rise was meteoric. At 24 in 1793, he's already a general. In 1795 and 96, he crushes the Austrian and Sardinian armies, and before long, all of Italy and Switzerland had fallen under French domination as well. In 1799, at 30 years old, he is the most powerful man in France. He issues a new constitution. Essentially, he imposes one-man rule. And by 1804, he has crowned himself emperor. Napoleon tried to emulate Alexander the Great, and he almost succeeded. Under his rule, the French conquered or dominated Europe from the Baltic to the Adriatic. For a few years, there were French kings or princes in Madrid and Naples and Dubrovnik and Stockholm and Münster and Florence. France ruled the continent, while England ruled the waves. And this empire only fell to pieces when the French overextended themselves and invaded Russia, after which Napoleon was defeated, more by the Russian winter than by his enemies. But Napoleon was also the last and greatest of the enlightened despots. Great general that he was, his greatest work was the Civil Code, which we now know as the Napoleonic Code, a set of laws that gave permanent form to the gains of the revolution: individual liberty, freedom to work, freedom of conscience, equality before the law. The Civil Code was in the tradition of liberal humanism that we've seen operating since the Renaissance, with its interest in the individual and its lack of interest in women, regarded as mere machines for making children and second-class citizens at best. The victories of Napoleon's armies prepared the way for the victories of the Napoleonic Code, and also prepared the way for the evolution of the people occupied by the French towards individual freedom. Napoleon's armies acted as a catalyst. Wherever they passed, they destroyed what was left of feudal institutions, they abolished serfdom, they emancipated Jews, they brought in freedom of enterprise. Before Napoleon, individual freedom found its limits on the Rhine. By 1812, these limits had advanced roughly to a line from Denmark to Bavaria and then south to the Adriatic, which happens also to be the line dividing free Western Europe from the communist world today. But having freed these people from their old regimes, having fed them on liberal ideas, having taught them to think in these new French ways, Napoleon produced a result he had not intended. He gave them the idea of national sovereignty and national self-determination. The idea that if they were free as individuals under the law, they should also be politically free, under a state which they chose themselves, not one imposed by the French. In spite of himself, the conqueror became the instrument of a political liberation and a political liberalism he had not intended to bring. Fraternal aid brought occupation, but it's obvious that neither the revolution nor its wars, with the tons of human flesh they wasted, that none of these were quite in vain. They proclaimed that all men have rights. Women, unfortunately, took a bit longer, and in France, the home of the Napoleonic Code, very much longer indeed. They prepared the way for lower classes to enter political life. They suggested totalitarian methods and ideas that the 20th century was going to copy with enthusiasm. And they set out an agenda that we are still working out today. In our next program, we shall look at another very different kind of revolution that also changed the world, the Industrial Revolution. Until then.
Funding for this program was provided by the Annenberg CPB project.
For information on this program and others in the Annenberg CPB collection, call 1-800-LEARNER.